part of the world, that has consequences in other parts of the world. We are all interdependent. And in a strange sense, I think one of the reasons this idea has taken off, I mean, it's not just the joy of doing this program with you, but rather establishment outfits like The Economist magazine or the Financial Times or even Time magazine, I've been surprised, are all running stories on this little exercise. And that says to me that we've hit a particular moment. And I think we've hit that moment for two reasons. Firstly, because climate change is happening and it's changing consciousness. And secondly, in a curious and of course difficult way, the pandemic, coronavirus, what does it teach us? It teaches us we're all in this together. We have a common humanity. It doesn't matter who we are, where we live, what color, what religion, what gender, what sexual orientation. We are all affected to different degrees, but we are all affected. And that, I think, makes us feel more vulnerable as human beings. And our vulnerability is dependent on the well-being of the planet. So absolutely, this is the heart of the project.
Well, much of your work is around genocide. You published a book in 2016 called East-West Street on the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. What parallels do you see between the push to make ecocide a crime and your work defining genocide?
Well, the crimes that we've been talking about, the old ones, the first four, were all invented basically in 1945. It was the horrors of the Second World War, the horrors of the mass murder of Jews and Roma and Poles and others that caused lawyers to sit down and think, how can we stop this from happening again? And literally in the space of the summer of 45,
good job, lawyers.
These terms, genocide, crimes against humanity, were invented and then applied retroactively, which is perhaps not so great, to those who sat in the dock in famous courtroom 600 in Nuremberg. And for 75 years, those are the crimes that we've had. And when this foundation came along to me and said, you who have litigated cases in international courts, you who in December 2019 sat next to Aung San Suu Kyi in the World Court arguing that her government was committing a genocide against the Rohingya, we would like you to work with us to create this new international crime. And I did it in part because I was motivated by the actions of those forebears, those people who 75 years ago, when terrible things had happened, didn't curl up in a corner and weep. They got up and they put pen to paper and they went around persuading people that something has to be done. Now, I'm not starry-eyed. The invention of crimes against humanity and genocide did not stop terrible things happening, but they did change the world. They changed consciousness, and I think I'm very inspired by that group, very, very inspired.
I'm Jen White. You're listening to 1A. We're talking about ecocide and the push to make environmental destruction an international crime. With us, Philippe Sands. He's a lawyer at the Matrix Chambers in London. He's also co-chair of the expert panel that's drafting the legal definition of ecocide. We're also hearing from you. Colin tweets, "This is amazing. I never imagined humanity as a whole would take wanton destruction of the natural environment as a serious problem. I was elated, no ecstatic, no hopeful when you said a group was attempting to establish global ecocide rules." We also want to hear from you. Do you think environmental degradation should be a crime? You can comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, or send us an email at 1A@WAMU.org. Philippe, are you getting any pushback from people who think comparing a genocide, the Holocaust, to something like the BP oil spill is insulting?
Another fine question, Jen. Not yet, but it will come. I mean, we will conclude our work in about 3 months' time. I'm pretty hopeful and optimistic. And then we will have a series of consultations. And at that point, the rubber hits the road. And we start talking to governments. And we need to persuade governments to run with it. A number of governments have already said they're interested. France, Belgium, Austria, some of the Pacific Island countries, some of the countries from the south. Because, you know, there's another element of this. Just as in domestic situations, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, environmental degradation tends to be worse in poorer communities. So it is around the world. We are all aware of the sort of toxic dumping, the stories of terrible wastes being transported halfway around the world. and just dumped in particular communities and leaving them with the problem. So I'm quite hopeful also that countries from the south, known as developing countries, countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America, the Caribbean, will see that this is a way of achieving a new form of justice. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to persuade governments, and some governments will undoubtedly be lobbied by their large corporations, the oil and gas producers perhaps, or others who get engaged in similar activities, certain mining activities perhaps, will lobby, and there will then be a struggle.
Part of what I'm hearing you say or try to sort through is the idea of us rethinking our basic relationship with the earth, that rather than viewing it as a resource to be used, shifting our perspective and leaning more heavily on the idea that it's something that needs to be protected. But when we think about our economies and how deeply this idea of the earth as a resource to be used is ingrained in that, this just seems like such a steep hill.
It does. It really does. But I tend to be a sort of optimistic kind of person. So when I was a law student, I read a law review article which had a great title. To this day, actually, it's my favourite of all law review articles I've ever read. And it was published in the early 1970s by an academic at the University of Southern California, a remarkable guy called Christopher Stone. And the title of the law review article was called "Should Trees Have Standing?" And it posited the idea that we need to rethink our relationship with the world. We need to imagine the possibility that wildlife, natural spaces themselves have rights which are capable of being protected. And that idea was tested in a famous 1972 case before the US Supreme Court, Sierra Club versus Morton. And the issue was, who had the right to protect a wilderness area? Who had a legal interest? And the Supreme Court said, well, the wilderness area is entitled to be protected, and the question is who? And they settled on users, people who could show they benefited from access to that resource. And with that, in 1972, very curiously, under the administration of Richard Nixon, environmental consciousness became part of the law. So I think it's taking that idea and running with it. And you're right, it requires a leap of consciousness and a recognition that we are not masters of the universe. We're not in control of our planet. And that's what brings us, in a sense, back to coronavirus and the pandemic, and a recognition that some things are bigger than us.
We're discussing ecocide and the push to make environmental destruction an international crime. With us, Philippe Sands. He's a lawyer at the Matrix Chambers in London. He's also co-chair of the expert panel that's drafting the legal definition of ecocide. We're also hearing from you. Ted is doubtful. He emails, it would be better for the world organizations to spend time, money, and effort on diplomacy efforts. We also heard from Tack, who tweets, ecocide is a clear existential threat to humans in the world. Kudos to you for your work. It gives me hope. Well, we'll hear more from you and from our guest in a moment. This is 1A.
CPR and KRCC thank Wright Water Engineers for